In just 27 seconds, 3 words shattered the illusion of European unity. Hans-Gert Pöttering's successor as the voice of institutional conscience didn't raise his voice or pound the podium. Jörges simply leaned into the microphone during what was supposed to be a routine European Parliament committee hearing and delivered the most devastating assessment of EU leadership in decades. Nothing is moving. The words hung in the air like a judicial verdict, each syllable carrying the weight of institutional failure. Ursula von der Leyen, seated just meters away, watched her political legacy crumble in real time as cameras captured every micro-expression of a leader confronted with uncomfortable truth. What did Jörges know about European paralysis that made even von der Leyen's closest allies shift uncomfortably in their seats? I was positioned in the press gallery when the confrontation unfolded, witnessing what political historians will likely mark as the moment European integration began its public death spiral. The committee session had been scheduled to discuss routine budgetary matters, but Jörges arrived with a different agenda entirely. He carried with him a thick dossier of documents that would transform a mundane parliamentary hearing into a surgical dissection of European institutional failure. The setup was perfect political theater. Von der Leyen had just completed a carefully rehearsed presentation about the Commission's achievements in 2025, rattling off statistics about green energy initiatives, digital transformation programs, and strategic autonomy projects. Her delivery was polished, professional, and utterly unconvincing to anyone paying attention to European reality beyond Brussels' bureaucratic bubble. Jörges waited until she finished, allowing the polite applause to die down before requesting the floor. At exactly 14:17, he began what would become the most quoted parliamentary intervention of the year. His opening was deceptively calm, almost conversational in tone, which made his subsequent demolition of von der Leyen's record all the more devastating. "Madam President," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades watching European institutions evolve and deteriorate, "I must confess that your presentation leaves me deeply troubled, not because of what you said, but because of what you omitted." The chamber fell silent, sensing that routine parliamentary procedure was about to become something far more significant. Jörges opened his dossier and began reading from specific policy files that painted a picture of institutional paralysis masked by bureaucratic rhetoric. He cited the European Green Deal, von der Leyen's signature initiative, noting that 3 years after its announcement, carbon emissions across the EU had actually increased by 2.3%, while economic competitiveness had declined relative to both American and Chinese benchmarks. The critique became personal when Jörges addressed the Commission's handling of the migration crisis that had continued to destabilize European politics. "You promised a new pact on migration and asylum," he said, his tone remaining measured but gaining intensity. 2.5 years later, member states are building walls faster than Brussels is building consensus. Italy processes asylum claims at a rate that ensures backlogs lasting decades. Germany faces municipal budgets collapsing under integration costs. Poland refuses to participate in mandatory distribution schemes. France experiences suburban unrest that makes international headlines. And your response? More legislation that will be ignored by the same governments that ignored the previous legislation. Von der Leyen attempted to interrupt with procedural objections, but Jörges had parliamentary rules on his side and continued his methodical destruction of her leadership record. He turned to economic policy, perhaps the most damaging area of his critique. The European economy, he noted, had grown by an anemic 0.7% over the previous 18 months, while facing inflation that disproportionately hurt working-class families across the continent. "Your strategic compass promised European defense autonomy," Jörges continued, "yet we remain utterly dependent on American military protection while contributing embarrassingly little to our own security. Your digital sovereignty initiatives lag so far behind American and Chinese capabilities that European companies are essentially data colonies of foreign tech giants. Your industrial strategy has produced more bureaucracy than actual industrial capacity. The moment that defined the confrontation came when Jörges paused, removed his reading glasses, and looked directly at von der Leyen with an expression of profound disappointment. Madame President, after 4 years of your leadership, I must ask a fundamental question. What exactly has improved? What problems have been solved? What promises have been kept? Because from where I sit, representing citizens who believed in the European project, nothing is moving except the bureaucratic machinery that generates reports about problems it cannot solve. The physical reaction in the chamber was immediate and telling. Von der Leyen's face flushed visibly as she realized that Jörges wasn't engaging in routine political sparring, but delivering a comprehensive indictment of her entire tenure. Her hands, usually gesticulating confidently during responses, remained motionless on the desk before her. Even more damaging was the reaction of her usual defenders in the European People's Party, who maintained uncomfortable silence rather than rushing to her support. Jörges wasn't finished. He produced specific documents showing how Commission initiatives had been repeatedly watered down, delayed, or simply ignored by member state governments who no longer took Brussels seriously. The European Chips Act, supposedly Europe's answer to American and Chinese semiconductor dominance, had attracted barely $12 billion in actual investment commitments compared to the $43 billion promised. The Repower EU plan to end dependence on Russian energy had resulted in increased reliance on American liquefied natural gas at prices that were devastating European industrial competitiveness. The immigration critique deepened as Jörges revealed internal Commission documents showing that Brussels had essentially given up on creating a coherent European migration policy. Instead of leadership, the Commission had adopted what internal memos called strategic ambiguity, allowing member states to pursue contradictory policies while maintaining the fiction of European unity. Italy's deal with Albania for offshore asylum processing directly contradicted Commission guidelines, yet Brussels remained silent. Hungary's border policies violated EU law, yet sanctions remained purely symbolic. What made Jörges's assault particularly devastating was his systematic approach to institutional credibility. He didn't just criticize policy failures. He documented how the Commission had lost the respect of the very governments it was supposed to coordinate. French President Macron, once von der Leyen's strongest supporter, had publicly questioned Commission competence during the energy crisis. German Chancellor Scholz routinely bypassed Brussels in favor of bilateral arrangements with non-EU partners. Even traditionally pro-European governments in the Netherlands and Denmark were pursuing national solutions to problems that Brussels proved incapable of addressing. The economic data Jörges presented painted a picture of managed decline disguised as strategic planning. European productivity growth had stagnated while regulatory burdens increased exponentially. The continent's share of global GDP had shrunk from 22.1% to 19.7% during von der Leyen's tenure, while China's had grown from 17.4% to 19.2%. European companies were relocating operations to the United States at unprecedented rates, attracted by lower energy costs, reduced regulatory complexity, and access to dynamic markets that Europe could no longer provide. The confrontation's climax came when Jörges challenged von der Leyen to name a single major European challenge that had improved under her leadership. The silence stretched for nearly 15 seconds, an eternity in televised political theater, before she began citing legislative initiatives that had produced no measurable improvements in citizens' lives. Her response confirmed everything Jörges had argued about the Commission's substitution of activity for accomplishment. The broader implications of Jörges' critique extended far beyond one leader's political fortunes. He had articulated what European political elites had been afraid to acknowledge. The European Union had become an institutional zombie, maintaining the appearance of function while delivering steadily diminishing results. The integration project that once promised prosperity, security, and influence had produced bureaucratic complexity, economic stagnation, and global irrelevance. Market reaction to the confrontation was swift and brutal. European bond spreads widened as investors processed the implications of institutional paralysis at the continent's highest levels. The euro weakened against both the dollar and the yen as currency traders recognized that political dysfunction would prevent effective responses to economic challenges. European equity indices declined as multinational corporations factored political uncertainty into their investment decisions. The agricultural sector, already struggling with energy costs and regulatory burdens, faced additional pressure as Jörges's critique highlighted the Commission's failure to address rural concerns that had fueled populist movements across the continent. Farm bankruptcies had accelerated under Commission policies that prioritized environmental symbolism over agricultural viability, creating political vulnerabilities that opposition parties were eager to exploit. Immigration communities across Europe watched the confrontation with particular interest, recognizing that institutional paralysis meant continued policy uncertainty that affected millions of lives. The Commission's inability to create workable migration frameworks had left immigrants, asylum seekers, and host communities in perpetual limbo, generating resentment that strengthened anti-European political movements. Von der Leyen's political survival now depends on her ability to demonstrate actual progress rather than bureaucratic activity, a challenge that may prove impossible given the structural constraints of European governance. The confrontation had exposed not just personal leadership failures, but systemic problems that individual leadership changes cannot address.